Drunk Tendo, now you're playing with vodka, will not be seen at this time. For now, here's something that you might not regret in the morning. This is GTV, the center of the universe.
Sega.
The Sega Saturn. The name invokes an image of a far-off place, a beautiful, exotic light shining from millions of miles away. An untouchable world filled with unimaginable pleasures and delights. It may have been the perfect name to encapsulate the experience Sega was trying to deliver to the player in those days gone by. But the naming of this machine wasn't very hard and was known as the Saturn from the days when the machine was on the drawing board. That's because in the 1990s, Sega codenamed all of their projects with a corresponding celestial object. Stay here for the Sega Solar System story. Sega! In 1988, the Mega Drive, aka Genesis, was the center of the Sega universe. The new 16-bit hardware was a sophisticated machine, lightning fast for the time, and capable of near-perfect arcade conversion. The machine was poised to take over the world, and for most of the world in the 1990s, it did. With Sega in the market leader position in the US, UK, Brazil, Australia, and most of Europe, as well as having a dedicated following in Japan and Korea, they were not going to stop at just the Mega Drive. In fact, a whole galaxy of products, for lack of a better term, were developed to maintain and solidify that position. And almost all of those products were given code names of the planets of the solar system, with the Mega Drive/Genesis at the center of this orbit, from which we can see moving all around us. Now, I did start this episode about the Sega Saturn, which was the only machine from this era to make it to the store shelf using a planetary name. But the Sega Solar System didn't begin in 1994. Actually, it was much earlier than that. Basically, from the moment the Mega Drive was born, the Sega Solar System was already in orbit. The first project born out of Sega's labs at this time was Project Mercury, named after the first planet in the solar system. Project Mercury became the Game Gear. At the end of 1988, the Mark III and Master System were over at Sega, at least in Japan, where all game development was moved to the Mega Drive. Though of course the Master System continued on elsewhere. The plan was to somehow keep the Mark III alive and still profitable, which led to a full-color portable game machine better than Nintendo's Game Boy. Yes, I know Sega was courted by Epix for the Atari Lynx for a while there too. The Game Gear started being shown off in Japan in the summer of 1990 and was formally released on October 6, 1990. It sold okay in Japan, almost 2 million units, and you can find them in used shops every now and then. Outside of Japan, the Game Gear was very popular, and much cooler than the Game Boy, of course. And while the TV tuner no longer works, the Master Gear converter will let you play proper Master System games on the Game Gear forever, if you have them. The imagery of Mercury actually fit the Game Gear quite well. Mercury is the fastest planet, and the Roman god Mercury was the messenger of the gods, always on the go. A perfect, complementary image of what carrying a portable Mark III would be like. Oh, and one final point of trivia to wow friends and strangers alike. Mercury is also on the periodic table of elements, and all Game Gear models, at least in Japan, start with the letters that designate Mercury on the periodic table, Hg.
パズルゲームぷよぷよもぷよっと大人気というわけで、いつでもどこでもカラーが楽しいゲームギア。
あ、32ビットのゲームだね。メガドライブが32ビットになるのさ。
ソフトも新次元グラフィックス。
しかもこんなに安いんだぜ。
すげえ。
スーパー 32X。セガ。
The second planet in the solar system is Venus. Another portable machine takes Venus's designation in the Sega solar system, the Nomad. This machine was released in 1995 and is in nearly every way identical to the original Sega Genesis. It's very commonplace these days to take the game you've played at home all day with you for that extra level grind. But in 1995, it was very groundbreaking. It was a technical feat to shrink the Genesis down, first of all. But then, unlike the Game Gear, Sega didn't double dip and force you to buy different versions of the same game. The Nomad is a direct descendant of the Mega Jet, which was the same machine but without a screen, that connected to a TV or monitor that were available for rent on certain Japan Airlines flights and were also sold briefly in Japan in 1993. Venus was also the Roman goddess of beauty, and there's nothing more beautiful than Phantasy Star 4 on the go. As a final note, one more page was added to the Project Venus story, as Sega unveiled a long-lost prototype of the Nomad in 2020 that bore the name Venus. Next up is the third planet in the solar system, our home, Earth. Was there ever a Sega Earth? Well, no. Only recently has Sega admitted there was never a project of any kind called Earth. For years, many had speculated on the matter, but it had never been 100% airtight slam dunk proven. Many assumed that Project Earth was the Mega Drive and Project Moon became the Sega CD. If you consider the Mega Drive as the centerpiece of Sega's fortunes in its heyday, you might assume that it could have been named after Earth. But it isn't true, as the code name for the Mega Drive was Mark V, following in the tradition of past Sega hardware. However, it was admitted by Sega officially that the Mega Drive Mini, released in 2019, was actually known as Project Moon, earning its name from members of the project erroneously believing the Mega Drive was called Project Earth, and therefore the mini version of that should have some kind of connection. As far as I know, no one was fired over the mistake. But when you start up a Sega CD, you see a picture of the Earth and Moon in orbit. Was this a secret tip of the hat to a Project Earth and Moon? Well, if it makes you feel better to keep that hope in your heart, I guess it won't hurt anybody. The fourth planet in the solar system is Mars. For Sega, Project Mars became the 32X, an attachment that was brilliant in its capabilities. You could upgrade your 16-bit Mega Drive or Genesis into a 32-bit machine for less than half the price of what a 32-bit machine was expected to cost. And you could have that 32X now, not in a year or two. That is, if now was 1994. Ah, those were the days when sets of hardware would leapfrog over each other year after year, rather than now when each new machine comes out once every 8 years or so, and there's nothing very new about it. Some people may look back and laugh, but the rush to get to the next gen was important at the time. So very important. And there were many who jumped on the idea. I was just one of them. Mars was the Roman god of war, and so the codename Project Mars fit the 32X perfectly. Video games, as a business, is a war, a never-ending battle for your money, time, and space in the house. To have 32-bit games ready 1 or 2 years before Nintendo or Sony was a shot across the bow, retaliation, preemptive strike, and whatever other warfare terms you could come up with. Passing through the asteroid belt, we come to the fifth planet in the solar system, Jupiter. For Sega, Project Jupiter was to be a cartridge version of the Saturn. Now, of course, this was never released, and the Saturn was, and with it, cartridges were never seen or heard from again. So what is the story behind the Sega Jupiter? Well, I need to jump all over the place to frame this complex issue into a simple, understandable explanation. But if you're watching this, you're part of the smartest audience on YouTube. Very smart. Surely smart enough to follow along. The Saturn has its own legacy, but it kinda gets overshadowed by the big Nintendo-Sony rivalry, or schism, that took place in the early 90s. Of course, you know Nintendo and Sony were to team up for the Super NES CD add-on, which Sony could release as an all-in-one called the PlayStation. You know, like the Wonder Mega. Nintendo didn't like the terms because it gave Sony more control than Nintendo would have liked, which, if it was 0.001%, that's still too much for them. And so they dumped Sony for Philips. and eventually ended up doing nothing with CD-ROMs at all until all of this was long over anyway. That's Nintendo for you. But not long after that very public breakup, Sony teamed up with Sega of America, which led to Sony ImageSoft producing several Sega CD games, while Sony prepped the actual PlayStation, which, before it became reality, could possibly have seen Sony and Sega as partners. Tom Kalinske was strongly in favor of teaming up with Sony for various reasons, including marketing and production resources. However, that partnership would, just like the deal with Nintendo, cede some control and some profit from Sega to Sony, which the Japanese HQ was wary against. Had the Sega PlayStation deal gone through, the Saturn and the development that it had up to that point could be saved and moved to a different machine, locking Sony out. And since the main feature of the PlayStation was the CD-ROM, that meant Project Jupiter would stick with cartridges. Now all that's happening behind the scenes, and for us on the other side of the curtain, we would get small doses of info, in little snippets of hot rumors and gossip, from the likes of Quarterman. Many of these were merely a sentence or two, without any real substance. 25 years on, they've been filtered and processed through websites and YouTube to paint a picture larger than what probably happened. So while Sega and Sony go round and round trying to figure things out, Sega simply had a plan A and a plan B. And with 32X, a plan C too. It's why Project Jupiter and all kinds of hardware and software doesn't actually exist in any form beyond a name or a rough sketch. But until fall 1994, none of this stuff actually mattered because it wasn't for sale. It was all talk, something to fill up a magazine and get you excited for the next shoe to drop in the following issue. That's it! I wonder how much old Q-Man actually knew and how much was complete, grade A, you know what.
1994年、それははるか土星で開発された。Saturn from Saturn。64ビット級ゲームマシン、セガサターン地球新発売。Sega。テレビを使ってラクラクプリント。イエーイ！人気のキャラも勢ぞろい。セガハイテクボディプリンタープリファン新発売。
The sixth planet in the solar system is Saturn, and Project Saturn was released as is. It's obviously the one machine we know the most about. Many of you probably have one, so there isn't much to say that you already don't know. However, you actually can't say, yeah, the Saturn was the one machine that had its codename survive all the way to the end, because it isn't true. The Saturn actually began life as Project Aurora, though soon after it was realized that this project would become Sega's sixth TV game machine. The codename was changed to Saturn, the sixth planet, and all future projects at the time were then assigned planetary names as well, while Aurora would resurface years later as an arcade board in the early 2000s, and as a star map projector released under Sega Toys. I don't know who made the final call to keep the name Saturn, but after 2 years of mentioning the Saturn month after month in magazines, they probably thought, hey, we should just go with it. And since Saturn was the sixth machine from Sega, and Saturn is the sixth planet from the Sun, it's just cool how everything lined up in the end. The seventh planet in the solar system is Uranus. It's not known if anything ever used this name, or if nothing was ever designated Project Uranus, no one knows why. Now I know what you're all thinking, and it would certainly have been great ammo for Nintendo or Sony to make fun of such a machine. However, at least in Japanese, they call this planet Uranus, or Tennosei, so that wouldn't matter much, at least in Japan. I guess sometimes the answer is that there is no answer. You can believe it was the code name for the Prologue 21 if you want. The 8th planet in the solar system is Neptune. Sega had a Project Neptune waiting in the wings. Though never released, Project Neptune would have been a Genesis 32X all-in-one machine. No add-on needed. As well, 32X, or Neptune cartridges, would probably replace Genesis ones at some point. A few design drawings were shown off in 1995, but the machine never came to be. In early 1996, to strengthen the Saturn against the PlayStation and upcoming N64, Sega cut the price of the Saturn to $200, dropped the Genesis, 32X, and Sega CD entirely, and focused solely on the Saturn. Regardless of what opinion you have on this move, it meant Project Neptune would never become reality. In 2001, EGM played an April Fool's joke on everyone by saying that they had a stack of Neptunes in their office and would be selling them off. The 9th planet in the solar system is Pluto. For over a century after the discovery of Neptune, astronomers theorized a potential 9th planet, which was finally discovered and named Pluto in 1930. The 9th planet existed as standard textbook learning until 2006, when the International Astronomical Union demoted Pluto to a dwarf planet. However, Project Pluto is a great planetary parallel, as for many years we all thought the Sega solar system ended with the 8th planet, thinking all had been discovered. Then, much like the real Pluto, something that was out there all the time finally became known. Project Pluto was uncovered in 2013 by a former Sega employee who had one of only 2 machines ever produced. The machine was a basic Saturn with a Netlink modem built right in, kind of bridging the gap between Saturn and Dreamcast. Now we're actually not quite done, because there are still 2 more Sega machines that were part of the Sega solar system, Project Janus and Project Titan, both named after moons of Saturn. Project Titan was a simple, straightforward design that allowed for an arcade board very similar to Saturn hardware, officially named STV, which meant easy porting of games from the arcade to home and vice versa. In a way, choosing Titan as its code name was very fitting. Project Janus was something quite different on the other hand. Project Janus did make it to store shelves in Japan, but not as any standard video game, but rather a drawing tablet, camera, and printing device. In 1996, Sega released these devices, known as Picture Magic, Pre-fun, and Digio SJ1. SJ stood for Sega Janus. The Digio took photos, while the Picture Magic allowed you to alter and enhance them. The Pre-fun printed the photos out to share with friends. You may wonder why Janus was chosen, as it isn't near the size or the importance as Titan or other moons of Saturn. But you must remember that each celestial body is named after a Roman or Greek deity whose characteristics define that body. Janus was a Roman god of transition and was often depicted with 2 or more faces. The Picture Magic is much like Janus, a machine that isn't all you see on the surface, as Picture Magic is basically a repurposed 32X. And in fact, 32X parts that were never shipped were recycled into more than a few units of Picture Magic. As Sega planned to move beyond the Saturn, the Sega solar system was dropped. It had, after all, been fully explored, and the time had come to move on. The next major machine from Sega would be the Dreamcast, which was developed in different forms under the names Katana and Black Belt. As well, Sega continued on into the 21st century, with more software, toys, and other merchandise. Though the Saturn and all the others have left Sega's orbit, the bright star in the sky that Sega is shines on, hopefully never to set.